Takže dámy a páni a dámy, príprava na FOMC Meeting. Nemám žiadnu pozíciu, len tak pre vašu informáciu skrz toho, že som live, ale ináč rozmýšľam, že sa tam šupnem na nejaký ten shortik. Len sa bojím toho, že príde ešte otestovanie 42 500 počas livestreamu. Ale vyzerá to zatiaľ slušne, čo sa týka nejakých shortík príležitostí. Vidím, že je tu trošička menej ľudí. A viete čo? Dobre, čiže počkáme, pokiaľ sa tu naškrabe zo pár ľudí a následne sa pozrieme. O 8 minút dostaneme dáta ohľadom CPI-ka. Čiže môže to byť celkovo dosť zaujímavé. Môžeme očakávať nejakú zvýšenú volatilitu skrz toho, že proste stále to tak je. Čiže asi toľko k tomu. Dobre. Dúfam, že všetci sedíte na zadkoch, ste pripravení na tú psychopatiu, ktorá môže prísť. A dúfam, že teda aj príde. A užijeme si tento marketík trošička viac. Zdarec, Bitcoin is going to zero. Skoro je na mieste. Dobre. Ahoj Tome, zdravím ťa Bill Gates. Dneska to bude asi troška dlhšie, keďže ten šašek bude rozprávať. Čiže dúfajme, že teda nemúneme nejako úplne šialenie, čiže... Ale malo by to byť celkovo, myslím si, že v pohodičke. Dobre. Patroni, dneska o 9:00 vám vyjde ešte jedno video na Kamino a Drift platformu. Dobre, ja tu už mám všetko prichystané, už len potrebujem spraviť túto vec. Veľmi vyzerá zaujímavé na tie 200 Bitcoin, ale teda môže prísť nejaký ten push na 42 600. Celkovo dosť dneska zaujímavé, že sme sa dostali práve nad úroveň tej hodnoty 41 500 $. Následne ste mohli využiť longy, keďže táto línia tu bola už od včera nakreslená a zakreslená. Čiže celkovo veľmi pekný push, hej, prakticky od jednej hodnoty po druhú. Celkovo dneska market sa trošička vďaka tomuto pushu zazelenal, ale ja som si dneska dával voľnosť skrz toho, že tie tradeíky alebo tie rozhodnutia budú, myslím si, že oveľa lepšie práve po Fede. Hej, po Fede. Dobre, čo som to tu chcel spraviť? Takto. Jak sme to mali minulé? Nie, takto sme to mali, lebo takto sa mi to viac páči. Čiže S&P 500. Ale mali sme to takto a hen takto a toto takto. Čiže dáme si len 5 minútovku a zatiaľ nech sa páči S&P 500 market is going to the mini moon. Čiže S&P 500 pushola party, toto tu máme a následne Bitcoinik si prehodíme takisto na 5 minútovku a dáme si ho na automatiku máme, čiže takto. Čiže uvidíme. Zatiaľ teda dosť pozitívne naladený S&P 500 market. Dáta. Dobre, čiže dáta. Tu nám bude rozprávať Šašek. FOMCčko. FOMC, aký to je? Kde je to? Troška si to rozšírime, lebo to vôbec nevidím. Február, čiže sme na konci. December. Tu je. Dobre. Takže, tu na to uvidíme ako druhé, mám taký pocit. Takže, 5,5 úrokové sadzby, tam sa dá celkovo očakávať, že oni tie úrokové sadzby nedvihnú, lebo nemajú príliš veľa dôvodov, hej, tá inflácia síce je pozastavená, ale zatiaľ teda úplne pohodičke sa jej darí. Čiže tam žiadne problémy dneska neboli. PPI-ko sa trafili prakticky do očakávaní. Troška pozitívnejšie tie očakávania boli, keďže Producer Price Index z mesiaca na mesiac prakticky nezažíva žiadny progres, čiže je na nulovej hodnote, čo je lepšia správa ako tie ich očakávania. Čiže aj túto prečilo trošička očakávania. Core PPI z roka na rok takisto pozitívnejší, než boli očakávania, čiže to vyklesanie je tu dosť dramatické oproti predchádzajúcemu cyklusu, hej, 2,3% a pád na 2,2%, keďže očakávania boli 2,2, po prípade 2,1, čiže celkovo dneska dostali ďalšie dobré dáta do Ameriky. Uvidíme, že ako na to zareaguje Fed, ale celkovo po tých dátach, ktoré sme dostali včera a takisto aj dnes, tak nie je dôvod na to, aby sme sa mali nejako báť, že úrokové sadzby by mali proste nejako dramaticky stúpnuť. FOMC Watch, pozrieme sa ešte na to. Ale tam by mala byť už skoro 100% šanca. Hej, tie percenta tam budú dosť brutálne. 98,2%. Ako hovorím, nie je tam vôbec žiadny dôvod, prečo by to malo prakticky stúpať. Už sú tu očakávania aj na znižovanie, ale zatiaľ teda uvidíme, čo povie Paulík. Aj keď myslím si, že zase znova toho príliš veľa tam nezažijeme. Bitcoin zatiaľ teda stagnuje. On má v kúse tú istú kravatu, nie? Under AVAX, ak stúpa, poistí si to stopkou do plusu. Lebo dá sa očakávať, že môže byť volatilnejší market. Čiže nejaký dip na 41 400 dolárov a pump na 42 600 by nemal vôbec nikoho prekvapiť. Čiže práve preto si treba zabezpečiť fakt, že tu na nikdy neviete, čo z nich vyjde. A dá sa očakávať, že proste žiadna zmena nenastane a tým pádom môžeme očakávať, že aj Bitcoin zdochne. Hej, čiže dá sa očakávať, že proste Bitcoin si povie, že OK, stačilo to vyklesanie, proste nechce sa mi už ísť nikde. Máme tu brutálne odrazenie na 21 na daily, čiže ono to skôr vyzerá teda na daily aspoň, to vyzerá ako continuation. Aj keď tu na otočky ešte nie sú, ale na daily, na price akcii, na EMA-kách sme masakrálne bullish. Fakt, že masakrálne bullish a teda tie targety 45 a 47 ešte stále ostávajú otvorené. Na 12 hodinke prakticky potrebujeme zatvárať práve nad úrovňou 42 265 dolárov, aby nám to bolo potvrdené. Čiže dnešok vyzerá fakt, že dosť dobre. Hlavne teda, keď sa pozrieme na daily chart, tam to vyzerá fakt, že veľmi slušne. No Sevas, Adame, Sevas, ďakujem ti veľmi pekne za 1,49. ...31.12. by mielo byť ďalší, to je za 14 dní, jestli sa nemýlim. Nie, má byť práve, že... Už tu o chvíľku prídu dáta. 31. januára, nie 31.12., ale 31. januára. Čo hovoríš na Cardano, Tome? Nič. Cardano pohodičke. Počuj, nadstavoval si Helium mašiny v novej appke? Nenastavoval som tam vôbec nič. Oni dajak fungujú. Či tam sa niečo... Musím sa pozrieť, že či sa tam vôbec niečo zmenilo. Lebo neviem vôbec, že o čom rozprávaš. Lebo sa mi len prehodili... tak ako boli, hej. No a je to tu, nech sa páči, je to úplne v zadku, alebo teda nie v zadku, obrovský pozitívna správa. Navyšovanie sa teda nekonalo, okamžitá reakcia S&P 500 Market, ideme to the moon. Čiže toto mi dajte krásne preč a pôjdeme sa pozrieť na predikciu, alebo teda projection, čiže zatiaľ teda long-term rates projection je 2,5%, interest rates je 2,5%, ale to od toho majú ešte riadne ďaleko. Terajšie úrokové interest rates projection, wow, už to tak vyriešili, na 5,4%, interest rates projection 30 year 2,9%, o 2 roky, second year 3,6, first year 4,6, čiže na ďalší rok chcú ísť na 4,6. Nech sa páči moon. A Bitcoin ide s ním, čiže Bitcoin is going to the moon. Hej, to the mini moon. Takže veľká krása. Veľká krása. Dobre, ideme sa pozrieť na projekciu, čo je na tej projekcii. Ešte si dáme refresh. No, hovorím 47, to v pohodičke môže byť. Ale toto je ešte len prvotná reakcia, čiže bacha, hej. Neviem, či sa to príliš veľmi oplatí tradovať. Asi by som ani nepovedal, lebo tu je projekcia. Statement, predpokladám, že tam nič príliš veľmi nebude dramatické na tom statemente. Čiže bankový systém sounds and resilient, čiže stále je veľmi zvučný a silný. Job moderated, to isté dokola. Tight financials and credit conditions for households and businesses are like higher in inflation, bla bla bla, bla bla bla. Úrokové sadzby ostávajú úplne tie isté, target majú úplne ten istý, hej, je to prakticky stále tie 2%, ktoré prakticky oni stále rozprávajú. Uvidíme, teraz to bude závisieť prakticky od Powella, že či tam on konečne podaví tú retoriku, alebo bude stále taký drsný a dramatický. S&P 500 market, teda vyzerá to tak, že je lepší asset pre dneska ako Bitcoin. Koľko? Dobře, tak nie, ono to len vyzerá dramaticky. Dobre, Bitcoin push, kompletne každý jeden altcoin teraz si pôjde svojim svetom, svetom. Čiže zatiaľ teda žiadne zmeny, predpokladám, že aj tie ich nastavenia budú úplne, ale že úplne také isté, čiže targety majú tie isté, MBSK je to isté. Mám taký pocit, že minule bolo 36 miliard dolárov vyťahujú za mesiac, teraz to dali na 35, alebo sa mi to len zdá, čiže nie som si plne istý, hej, ale tie čísla vyzerajú byť úplne identické. Repurchase agreement operation and offer rate of 5.3% with counterparty limit 150 billion a day. Čiže to je to isté. Dobre, ideme sa pozrieť na projekciu, pokiaľ príde Paulík. Paulík ešte si neprišiel, on má prísť o pol hodinu. To bude údiel toto. Dobre, takže čaute. Marek, zdravím ťa. Zdárno, Sevas a takisto aj Martin Dráb. Ďakujem ti veľmi pekne za 200 kaček. No, projekcia. Toto je asi taká tá najdôležitejšia vec, čo sa týka konca roka. Tie projekcie, že či sa teda trafia alebo nie. Solanička poskočila o $1, čiže to je veľká krása. Dneska som robil video a dokonca na tej Drift platforme akurát som to celkovo, myslím si, že dobre zavrel. Dobre. Čiže, a tu tiež asi veľké zmeny sa neudejú, čo sa týka toho HDPčka. Change in real HDP. September projection. Aha, tu sú septemberové projekcie. Čiže tie projekcie sa teraz výrazne zlepšili oproti septembru. Čiže change in real HDP. Čo je celkovo dobré asi teda pre Ameriku. Range unemployment rate, to je najzaujímavejšia vec, čiže očakávajú zvýšenie v nezamestnanosti, ale to sú tie isté dáta, tu na iba niekto copy-paste a ďalej. PCE inflácia, čiže prakticky do 2026 oni majú ten target na 2% inflácia. Čiže tu nás sa takisto troška sa zlepšila tá projekcia, keďže toto môže byť taká tá veľmi veľká vec, keď sa im to bude dariť. Hej, keď tá inflácia pôjde nižšie, teda očakávania v septembri boli, že inflácia pre rok 2023 bude ukončovaná na 3,3%, ale až v januári dostanú dáta prakticky za december. 2024 prakticky očakávajú, že bude lepšie, alebo teda očakávania sú teraz v decembri lepšie, ako boli v septembri, čiže na 2,4% a takisto v 2025 na 2,1%. Dobre, range prijímajú medzi, čiže teoreticky central tendency, toto je median. Central tendency medzi 2,2 až 2,5 je to všetko, očakávajú ten daný pohyb. Čiže aj keby to bolo 2,5, tak to nie je katastrofa na rok 2024. Tak, range je 2,1 a 2,7. Core PC, to je prakticky to isté, hej. 3,2. Jak to majú teraz na tej core? Ja už to nejdem preklikávať. Bacha, sme teraz na ďalšej rezistencii, alebo teda Bitcoin. 42 300, keď zatvoríme 270, keď zatvoríme na 12 hodinovke. Čiže až prakticky po dnešku môžeme niečo riešiť. Dobre, tu na nie je... Toto je GDP, to je prakticky to, čo som čítal. Čiže nezamestnanosť očakávajú, že, alebo teda píkla a následne, že bude ďalej sa ustáľovať. Hej, čiže pod tou projekciou si predstavte, hej, len si natiahnite ten graf, že to prakticky pôjde v týchto úrovniach, v týchto hodnotách. Dobre, akože na inflácii to majú asi teda najviac. Hej, že tu bude vyklesávať stále viac a viac. Až ten ich target. No. To sú funding rates, federal fund rates. 2024 5,5. Čiže teoreticky toto nám naznačuje, že by predsa len mohli znižovať úrokové sadzby smerom dole. Ale nič dramatické, 4,5. 450 bazických bodov. Teraz je 550 bazických bodov. Hej, tu nás môžete všimnúť, že skoro celý rok 2023 sa držali na tých 550 bazických bodov. Akože toto je ten median, hej, čiže u nich ten median znamená, že to je ich target, hej, na ktorý sa oni budú pozerať, je tých 4,5 bazických bodov. To preto vidíme takýto odstrel. Keďže tie úrokové sadzby predsa len uvidíme, že čo k tomu, ako sa k tomu vyjadrí Powell. Lebo toto môže byť celkovo dobrá správa, hej, 450, medzi 450 až 475 bazických bodov. Dobre, akože dobre, môže nám začať bull market. GDPčko. Tu nič. Unemployment rate. Prakticky. Nejaké dramatické zmeny tam nie sú od minula. Asi najviac na tých úrokových sadzbách. Hej, to PCE takisto. Hej, tu nám majú obrovské polepšenie. Keďže tu nám bola septembrová projekcia a tu nám je decembrová realita. Čiže predbehli to, alebo teda darí sa im to celkovo znižovať to PCčko. Hej, a práve to PCčko, alebo na tú infláciu sa práve spolieha a pozerá najviac Fed. Hej, čiže oni sa nepozerajú na CPI, ale na PCE, alebo teda PCE. A máme tu mini bullrun. S&P 500 market nezadržateľne. Toto všetko sa môže odraziť práve aj v Bitcoine, a to hlavne skrz toho, že keď sa pozeráme na to, že proste toto začne zažívať moon time, tým pádom investori budú viac risk on. Čiže to bude znamenať, že budú viac riskovať a budú viac chcieť investovať do marketu a tým pádom sa dá očakávať, že nejaké tie mini peňažky by mohli padnúť predsa len aj na tento daný market. Hej, čiže PC, inflation, očakávajú vyklesania. Čiže zatiaľ dobre. Ešte musím pozrieť jednu vec. Dobře. Dobre. Takto. Hen takto. No, dobře, idem sa vám venovať, lebo aj tak tu už... akože, pohode. Uvidíme, aj tak ten Šašo je najdôležitejší, lebo on bude zase toto čítať, to bude veľmi dlhý livestream. Ináč ja som brutálne rozkopaný, čiže keď si budem zývať, tak to proste berte troška s rezervou. 309 online ľudí a len 29 lajkov. Je to na smiech, no. Je to na smiech, alebo teda na plač. Je to na plač. Dobre, čiže o chvíľku začíname. Sice o chvíľku. O riadnu chvíľku začíname. Čiže čo? Pozrieme si nejaký sice coiny budú ísť takisto do šialenstva. Čo ukazuje? Na 12 dní ukazuje, ešte neukazuje ani buy. Na daily to malo ukazovať, nie? Na daily vyzerá veľmi silno Bitcoin. Dneska to môže byť celkovo dosť rozhodujúci deň pre Bitcoin. Boom, long na 4-hodinovke, na 2-hodinovke. No tuto láme všetky rekordy. No, vrtuľa do zadku. Vrtuľa do zadku. Prakticky, keď narušíme tento level 42, 450, hej, a začneme zatvárať, tak potom tie targety 43, alebo ani nie, že 43, to už potom, fakt, že sa môžeme pozerať zase na 45 a 47. Na tej zete si už obchodoval? Nie, zatiaľ som spúšťal iba ten drift, ktorý volám stále drift. Ja ho volám dirt, neviem prečo, ale je to drift. Radim, zdravím ťa. Áno. Recesia, alebo teda ono, nie recesia, ale obrovský dump marketu. Sice recesia. Hej, príde práve potom, keď zažijeme pivot. Ale Filip, o tom som rozprával x krát. Mám taký pocit, že na našej scéne, neviem, či to niekto ešte rozprával, ale ja som o tom rozprával už hodne dávno. A hodne dávno aj na to upozorňujem. Hodne častokrát. No čo na to hovoríš zatiaľ? Teraz som došiel. X kvantum krát. Áno, X kvantum krát. Zatiaľ akože sme pozitívne naladení. Cup of coffee. Cup of coffee? Či cup and handle? Môže byť cup and handle tam vytvorený. Hej, na tomto time frame. Vyzerá to akože stále treba sa ukľudniť pri tom, keď dostaneme dáta a hlavne keď takto ďaleko je Pavlík. Hej, čiže pokiaľ je Pavol takto ďaleko, on to tam vie rozvíriť, ale pochybujem, že by mal byť nejako extrémne negatívny, keďže on skôr bude. Lebo dáta prišli brutálne pozitívne. Fakt, že tie správy sú extrémne pozitívne. Hlavne tej projekcie, hej, vôbec to nevyzerá zle. Každý sa pozerá, mám taký pocit, že práve na akože oni sa určite pozerajú aj na GDPčko, nezamestnanosť, ale to nikoho nezaujíma. Hej, nikoho nezaujíma, každého zaujíma projekcia, každého zaujíma to, že ako oni očakávajú prakticky infláciu, hej, to PCčko, a následne úrokové sadzby, lebo hej, proste im kašľú na to, čo oni si tu ďalej píšu, prakticky už som to aj prešiel niekde. Hej, čiže každého zaujíma tá projekcia na úrokové sadzby, ktoré môžu proste celkovo dosť ochromiť ten market. Čiže uvidíme. Zatiaľ tie projekcie na 2024, akože ja to beriem pozitívne, možno je to zase negatívnejšia správa skrz toho, že možno veľa ľudí si myslí, že lebo tých 450 bazických bodov a 470 bazických bodov, ak by to malo byť, hej, že prakticky viacero tých dní by sa mali držať medzi 450 a 475. Je to poskok, je to 1% alebo 100 bázový posun smerom dole, čo je dobré, ale necelý 100 bazických bodov. Ale možno to nie je až toľko, koľko ľudia a analytici očakávali. Čiže tam môže prísť nejaký ten problém a hlavne skrz toho, že musíme si uvedomiť, že oni keď vyhlásia, že dobre, tento mesiac budeme mať 500 bazických bodov, to spomalenie marketu je možno 3-4 mesačné, možno poloročné, hej, čiže ono A napríklad, keby teraz prišli, aby povedali, OK, úrokové sadzby dávame na 2%, tak ako sme chceli, alebo teda to je náš target, hej, 2,5% si môžete všimnúť, že je od 225 bazických bodov až po 250 bazických bodov je ich target. Proste to je z dlhodobého pohľadu, proste nemôžeme očakávať nižšie dáta, hej, čiže zadarmo peniaze tu jednoznačne skončili, s tým už teda nepočítavajú a chcú to dať práve na tieto úrovni 2,5. A čo som chcel povedať? No, že zadarmo peniaze môžeme skončiť, ale aj keby to dali práve teraz, hej, že by prišiel Pavel a povedal, akože jednak určite by sme mali výbuch na markete, lebo by sa tam všetci zbláznili a proste každý by išiel all in do marketu, ale banky by mohli začať krachovať. Nie kvôli tomu, že proste niečo by sa tam šialené udialo, ale že tie úrokové sadzby prakticky budú mať dopad. To je jedno, že tento mesiac by to všetko nahodili naspäť na 2,5, lebo to sa neodzrkadlí na markete okamžite, hej. Ako som vedel, že 8 PM je u nás večer? To je nášho času. Hej, čiže neviem, že koľko je teraz v Amerike, tam nie je 8 PM. Proste len si nastavíš trading kalendár, hej, tu nás si dáš UTC time, lebo môžeš si tu dať všetky časy, čo ti treba, hej. A my vieme, že sme v tej UTC jednotke, nie? Čiže, a v Amerike majú kedy? 2 PM, 2:30, čiže je to 6 hodín posun, hej. No ja som takisto zvedavý, hej, lebo akože ono to vyzerá teraz všetko úplne paradičke, dostali sme sa z najväčších problémov, ale to stále prúser príde vtedy, keď to ľudia proste prestanú očakávať, hej, keď sa polámu všetci, že proste OK, už nepríde žiadna kríza, alebo teda nepríde žiadny dump, alebo nepríde žiadny pump a vtedy sa otáča tá loď. Dúfam, že nejaký Black Swan event nedôjde. Aj to sa môže stať. Aj to sa môže stať. Zatiaľ teda, hej, krásne. Na Bitcoine vidíte tie hodnoty rezistencie. Sice je to tak kráva zóna, no ale tak čo sa dá robiť. Hej, ale zatiaľ tie reakcie sú tam pekné na Bitcoine. Čiže práve preto netreba nikdy byť taký, že cipána, toto už nikdy nejde dole, alebo nikdy nejde hore. Prakticky, to je na week base. Neviem, že na ktorom timeframe to mám zase zaznačené. Ktorý to je? Neviem, na minútovke. No neviem, prečo je taký široký. Či to je na 45 minútovke? Nie. Na 12 hodín. Čiže to je 12 hodinovka. Dobre, keď sa bavíme o 12 hodinovke, tak nech to ostane 12 hodinovka. Čiže toto nech tu ostane na super. No tak akože ja nechápem. Kde v prdeli je tá línia? No dobré, akože serem na to. Nechcem ju hľadať, ale proste, stačí vám úplne sa pozerať na zatvorenie 42 428. Ale ináč, určite by som teraz nevstupoval do shortových pozícií, keď takto vidíte market. Ale určite by som nenechával long pozície bez stopky. To je na 100% počas FOMC meetingu alebo CPI-ka nikdy netradovať bez páky, lebo tam to môže byť veľmi drahé. No, čakáme na Pavla 9 minút. Zatiaľ teda žiadne navyšovanie úrokových sadzieb neprišlo, čo je pozitívna správa. Projekcie na ďalší rok nám naznačujú, že možno príde predsa len nejaké to znižovanie úrokových sadzieb. čo je obrovské očakávanie marketu a môžete si všimnúť, že aké dildo spravil S&P 500 market. Proste ten si dneska užil krásne zelenú sviečku a vyzerá to tak, že sa bude zelenať ešte dlhšie. Aspoň teda dneska. Mení si trenky. Určite si mení trenky, lebo Henry sa pýta, že kde je ten dedo. Mení si trenky podľa mňa. Na 100% si mení trenky. Alebo obchoduje. Hej, to je to, čo ja už nerobím na live streamoch a on ešte predtým, než proste, neviem, toto tak ide vstúpiť do marketu. Nie, podľa mňa on teraz dolonguje, hej, že proste pozatvára si svoje bullish pozície, následne si nastaví shorty, príde na poradu a povie, viete čo, nevyzerá to až tak najlepšie, šup, a potom počkajte sekundu, len si odbehnem, pozatvára shorty a potom povie, odžubával som. Zistil som, že nemám kávu. Dám si kávu teraz na večer. Sekundičku. No, dobře, čiže môžeme sa pripravovať na Uja Powella a kde bude. Dneska ináč je Champion Chess Tour Finals, ktoré si chcem pozrieť a akurát máme live stream, čiže nebudem to pozerať cez seba, určite nie. Jak sa oni volajú? Dobre, čiže máme to tu pomaličky postupne nastavené. Ja si to tu dám. Oni majú tu blbú zvučku tam. No, dobre, máte nejaké pozície alebo nie? Sekundu, ja si ešte pozriem, lebo som robil videjko pre Patreonov a mám taký pocit, že sa mi otvorila shortová pozícia na Solaníčke a je to pravda. Viete čo? Nechám to tak. Už s tým nič nerobím. Mário Ondruška. Ináč dneska nebudeme vôbec, ale že vôbec nebudeme pozerať na žiadne coiny. Hej, čiže žiadne predikcie, žiadne čítanie grafu. Zajtra ja spravím pre Patreonov live streaming, ale potom možno cez víkend, keď budem mať menej času, tak alebo na ďalšom live streame. Na ďalšom live streame v pondelok si môžeme prejsť viacero coinov. Alebo tí, čo ste na Patreone, tak budeme mať zajtra Patreon. Čiže tam si určite pozrieme viacero pozícií a takisto aj to portfólio, ktoré tam je. Dobre. Dám Pola party. A nech sa páči. Ešte ani nedošiel, ešte len sa blíži čas, kedy nastúpi Jerome Powell a už to tu dumpuje. Hovorím, on teraz si pozatváral longové pozície, nastavil si shorty a ešte aj možno napísal novinárom, že nebude to také pozitívne. Prišiel som včas na stream, konečne. VR, akože ani neveľmi, lebo meškáš zhruba nejakých 35 minút, ale teoreticky si tu predtým, než Ujo Pavel proste príde a začne kecať. Tome, zajtra bude live stream o 17:00. Áno, o 17:00 bude live stream a možno spravíme trošička dlhší live stream, lebo Klaudia bude mať ruku hore a ja som šofér, čiže Keď mi napíše, tak vtedy prídem. Ale zase nebudeme do 9, hej, alebo keď ona tam bude, dajme tomu, že do 11, tak určite nebudeme do 11. Ale áno, začneme o 17:00, čiže otázky, ale zajtra bude o čom rozprávať, keďže, no, dobre, nejdem predbiehať, lebo aj naposledy, čo bol FOMC Meeting, tak proste zažili sme pampola party, dampola party a po meetingu a na ďalšie ráno som sa zobudil na tých istých hodnotách, ako to bolo deň predtým. Čiže ja už sa ani na Fed nespolieham, hej. To je len jedna takéto X-ko, hej, jak si dávali basisti, hej, že si vyrezali nejaké to X-ko, že dobre, toto máme za sebou, tak my by sme si tiež mali dávať také kerky, že OK, čiarka 1, že OK, meeting máme za sebou a môžeme čakať ďalších 30 dní alebo viac než 30 dní na ďalší meeting, ktorý môže rozhýbať trošička market nepredvídateľnejšie. Basisti. Áno. Minule som nejakého typka videla, takže bolo, že srdce, rúžena, keby aspoň rúženka napísala, ale bolo tam rúžena, ale že mega preškrtnuté tak, len normálne zaškrabané a pod tým nejaké iné ženské meno. A vidím, že idú teraz do módy presne také kerky, že Nutella a iné veci. Dobre, aktivita na čete príliš veľmi nehýri, treba uznať. Koľko tu je vás hadov? Pozriem sa na to ešte. No. 365 tvári na mňa pozerá a 169 lajkov. Ty vole, to nemám ani 1 k utrom. Dobře. No. Blíži sa to. Čo? Kde sa... toto sme zabudli ešte. Chat. Ja nechcem chat. Chcem dať pool. Takže môžete si zahlasovať tí, čo chcete. Pavol už štartuje svoje mokasínky a o chvíľočku bude otvárať dvere. Moontime baby. A už je to tu. Ujo, Pavol prichází. Dobre, dajte mi vedieť, že či ho budete počuť. Ešte zatiaľ teda, hej, je tam ticho. Ale dajte mi vedieť, či ho budete dobre počuť. Keď nie, tak ja to nastavím. A okamžite market reakcie. Ešte ani neotvoril dvere a už tam máme jednu potvrdenú červenú sviečku na S&P 500 markete. Čiže ja budem teraz trošička tichšie, lebo hej. Čo budeme hovoriť, keď on bude hovoriť? Ale zatiaľ ešte neprišiel. Zatiaľ som prakticky na začiatku vysvetlil, že čo a ako. Ja si dávam vytetovať BlackRock, keď schvália ETF-ko. A keď ho zrušia, si dáš preškrtnúť. No, a už je tu gangsteris.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. As we approach the end of the year, it's natural to look back on the progress that has been made toward our dual mandate objectives. Inflation has eased from its highs, and this has come without a significant increase in unemployment. That's very good news. But inflation is still too high. Ongoing progress in bringing it down is not assured, and the path forward is uncertain. As we look ahead to next year, I want to assure the American people that we're fully committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal. Restoring price stability is essential to achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Since early last year, the FOMC has significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. We've raised our policy interest rate by 5.25 percentage points and have continued to reduce our securities holdings at a brisk pace. Our actions have moved our policy rate well into restrictive territory, meaning that tight policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation, and the full effects of our tightening likely have not yet been felt. Today, we decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged and to continue to reduce our securities holdings. Given how far we have come, along with the uncertainties and risks that we face, the committee is proceeding carefully. We will make decisions about the extent of any additional policy firming and how long policy will remain restrictive based on the totality of the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. I will have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that growth of economic activity has slowed substantially from the outsized pace seen in the third quarter. Even so, GDP is on track to expand around 2.5% for the year as a whole, bolstered by strong consumer demand as well as improving supply conditions. After picking up somewhat over the summer, activity in the housing sector has flattened out and remains well below the levels of a year ago, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. In our summary of economic projections, committee participants revised up their assessments of GDP growth this year, but expect growth to cool, with the median projection falling to 1.4% next year. The labor market remains tight, but supply and demand conditions continue to come into better balance. Over the past 3 months, payroll job gains averaged 204,000 jobs per month, a strong pace that is nevertheless below that seen earlier in the year. The unemployment rate remains low at 3.7%. Strong job creation has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers. The labor force participation rate has moved up since last year, particularly for individuals aged 25 to 54 years, and immigration has returned to pre-pandemic levels. Nominal wage growth appears to be easing, and job vacancies have declined. Although the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still exceeds the supply of available workers. FOMC participants expect the rebalancing in the labor market to continue, easing upward pressures on inflation. The median unemployment rate projection in the SEP rises somewhat from 3.8% at the end of this year to 4.1% at the end of next year. Inflation has eased over the past year, but remains above our longer-run goal of 2%. Based on the Consumer Price Index and other data, we estimate that total PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in November, and that, excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 3.1%. The lower inflation readings over the past several months are welcome, but we will need to see further evidence to build confidence that inflation is moving down sustainably toward our goal. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. As is evident from the SEP, we anticipate that the process of getting inflation all the way to 2% will take some time. The median projection in the SEP is 2.8% this year, falls to 2.4% next year, and reaches 2% in 2026. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We're highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate. and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. As I noted earlier, since early last year, we have raised our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points, and we have decreased our securities holdings by more than $1 trillion. Our restrictive stance of monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. The committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25 to 5.5%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. While we believe that our policy rate is likely at or near its peak for this tightening cycle, the economy has surprised forecasters in many ways since the pandemic, and ongoing progress toward our 2% inflation objective is not assured. We are prepared to tighten policy further if appropriate. We're committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation sustainably down to 2% over time, and to keeping policy restrictive until we're confident that inflation is on a path to that objective. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. While participants do not view it as likely to be appropriate to raise interest rates further, neither do they want to take the possibility off the table. If the economy evolves as projected, the median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 4.6% at the end of 2024, 3.6% at the end of 2025, and 2.9% at the end of 2026, still above the median longer-term rate. These projections are not a committee decision or plan. If the economy does not evolve as projected, the path of policy will adjust as appropriate to foster our maximum employment and price stability goals. In light of the uncertainties and risks and how far we have come, the committee is proceeding carefully. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks. In determining the extent of any additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. I wanted to ask, how should we interpret the addition of the word any before additional firming in the statement? I mean, does that mean that you're pretty much done with rate hikes and the committee has shifted away from a tightening bias and toward a more neutral stance? Thank you.
Moon.
So, specifically on any, we do say that in determining the extent of any additional policy firming that may be appropriate, so any additional policy firming, that sentence. So we added the word any as an acknowledgement that we believe that we are likely at or near the peak rate for this cycle. Participants didn't write down additional hikes that we believe are likely, so that's what we wrote down. But participants also didn't want to take the possibility of further hikes off the table. So that's really what we were thinking.
Čiže stále je tam šanca na zdvihnutie úrokových sadzieb.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Happy holidays, Mr. Chairman. Fed Governor Chris Waller said that if inflation continues to fall, then the Fed in the next several months could be cutting interest rates. I wonder if you could comment on whether you agree with Fed Governor Waller on that the Fed would become more restrictive if it didn't cut rates if inflation fell. Thank you, sir.
So, of course, I don't comment on any other officials, even those who work at the Fed. But I'll try to answer your question more broadly. So the way we're looking at it is really this. when we started out, right, we said the first question is how fast to move, and we moved very fast. The second question is, really how high to raise the policy rate, and that's really the question that we're still on here. We're very focused on that. As I mentioned, people generally think that we're at or near that, and think it's not likely that we will hike, although they don't take that possibility off the table. So that's when you get to that question, and that's your answer. There's a naturally it begins to be the next question, which is when it will become appropriate to begin dialing back the amount of policy restraint that's in place. So that's really the next question, and that's what people are thinking about and talking about. And I would just say this: we are seeing strong growth that appears to be moderating. We're seeing a labor market that is coming back into balance by so many measures, and we're seeing inflation making real progress. These are the things we've been wanting to see. We can't know. We still have a ways to go. No one is declaring victory. That would be premature. And we can't be guaranteed of this progress. So we're moving carefully in making that assessment of whether we need to do more or not. That's really the question that we're on. But of course, the other question, the question of when will it become appropriate to begin dialing back the amount of policy restraint in place, that begins to come into view. And is clearly a topic of discussion out in the world, and also a discussion for us at our meeting today.
Can you give some color as to the nature of that discussion today? Thank you.
Sure. So it comes up in this way today. Everybody wrote down an SEP forecast, so many people mentioned what their rate forecast was, and there was no back and forth, no attempt to sort of reach agreement, like this is what I wrote down, this is what I think, that kind of thing, and preliminary kind of a discussion like that. Not everybody did that, but many people did. And then I would say there's a general expectation that this will be a topic for us looking ahead. That's really what happened in today's meeting. I can't do the head count for you in real time, but that's generally what happened today.
Go to Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. At this point, can you confidently say that the economy has avoided a recession and isn't heading for one now? And if the answer is no, I'm curious about what you'd still be looking for.
I think you can say that there's little basis for thinking that the economy is in a recession now. I would say that. I think there's always a probability that there will be a recession in the next year, and it's a meaningful probability no matter what the economy is doing. So it's always a real possibility. The question is it? So it's a possibility here. I have always felt since the beginning that there was a possibility, because of the unusual situation, that the economy could cool off in a way that enabled inflation to come down without the kind of large job losses that have often been associated with high inflation and tightening cycles. So far, that's what we're seeing. That's what many forecasters on and off the committee are seeing. This result is not guaranteed. It is far too early to declare victory. And there are certainly risks. It's certainly possible that the economy will behave in an unexpected way. It has done that repeatedly through in the post-pandemic period. Nonetheless, where we are is we see the things that I mentioned.
I'm curious if you're looking back on the past year. You talked about navigating by the stars under cloudy skies. Can you talk about some of the ways in which the economy surprised you most this year, where you thought it would behave in one way and had to pivot to respond? Thanks.
So I think forecasters generally, if you go back a year, were very broadly forecasting a recession for this year, for 2023. And not only did that not happen, that includes Fed forecasters and really essentially all forecasters. A very high proportion of forecasters were expecting very weak growth or a recession. Not only did that not happen, we actually had a very strong year. And that was a combination of strong demand, but also real gains on the supply side. So this was the year when labor force participation picked up, where immigration picked up, where the distortions to supply and demand from the pandemic, the shortages and the bottlenecks really began to unwind. So we had significant supply side gains with strong demand, and we got what looks like a 2.5% plus or a little more than that growth year at a time when potential growth this year might even have been higher than that just because of the healing on the supply side. So that was a surprise to just about everybody. I think the inflation forecast is roughly what people wrote down a year ago, but in a very different setting. And I would say the labor market, because of the stronger growth, has also been significantly better. If you look back at the SEP from a year ago, there was a significant increase in unemployment. That didn't really happen. We're still at 3.7%. So we've seen strong growth, still a tight labor market, but one that's coming back into balance with support from the supply side, a greater supply of labor. It's that's what we see, and that I think that combination was not anticipated broadly.
Thanks, Howard Schneider with Reuters, and thanks for taking the questions. I wonder if you could give a little more color or detail on what motivates the lower rates next year. Whether it's a coincidence, for example, that the spread between PCE inflation, core inflation, and the federal funds rate stays constant over the year. Are you simply calibrating against the fall in prices, in the price level that you're expecting, in the rate of inflation that you're expecting, as opposed to supporting the economy?
Nothing quite that mechanical is happening. The SEP really is a bottoms up, built from the bottom up, right? So I think people are looking at what's happening in the economy, and I think if you look at the big difference from September in the SEP, the expectations for inflation this year, both headline and core, have come down, really significantly in 3 months. That's a big piece of this. At the same time, growth is turned out to be very strong in the third quarter, is slowing, we believe, as appropriate. And we've had several labor market reports which suggest, again, significant progress toward greater balance across a broad range of indicators. You're seeing so many of the indicators coming back to normal, not all of them. But so I think that people look at that and they write down basically each individual writes down a forecast and a rate forecast that goes with that forecast. We tabulate them and publish it. And so it isn't, you ask about real rates, I take it. That is something that we're very conscious of and aware of and monitor, and it's certainly a big part of, it's a part of how we think about things, but really it's broader financial conditions that matter, and as you well know, it's so hard to know exactly what the real rate is or exactly how tight policy is at any given time. So you couldn't follow that like it was a rule and think that you would get the right answer all the time, but it's certainly something that we're focused on. And indeed, if you look at the projections, I think the expectation would be that the real rate is declining as we move forward.
It sounds like the discussion over that, if I could follow up, has already kind of begun. I'm wondering, just related to Steve's question, how the tactics of this play out, given the slowing of inflation and the fact that the deeper you get into 2024, the closer you get to a presidential election. Do you want to front load this, in other words?
Yeah, no, we don't think about political events. We don't think about politics. We think about what's the right thing to do for the economy. The minute we start thinking about those things, we just can't do that. We have to think, what's the right thing? We'll do the things that we think are right for the economy at the time when we think is the right time. That's what we'll always do. So I mentioned we're moving carefully. One of the things we're moving carefully about is that decision over, that assessment really over whether we've done enough, really. And you see that people are not writing down rate hikes. That's us thinking that we have done enough, but not feeling that really strongly, confidently, and not wanting to take the possibility of a rate hike off the table. Nonetheless, it's not the base case anymore, obviously, as it was 60, 90 days ago. So that's how we're approaching things. And as I mentioned, we wrote down this SEP, and it talks about people have individual assessments of when it will be appropriate to start to dial back on the tight policy we have in place. And that's a discussion we'll be having going forward, but that's another assessment that we're going to make very carefully so as time goes forward.
Tak oni nie naivní retaileri, ale psychopatia marketu.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you've argued over the last year that policy tightening started before you actually lifted off because the market anticipated your moves and tightened on your behalf. The market is now easing policy on your behalf by anticipating a funds rate by next September that's a full point below the current level, with cuts beginning around March. Is this something that you are broadly comfortable with?
So this last year has been remarkable for the sort of seesaw thing back and forth we've had over the course of the year, of markets moving away and moving back and that kind of thing. So, and what I would just say is that we focus on what we have to do and how we need to use our tools to achieve our goals, and that's what we really focus on. And people are going to have different forecasts about the economy, and those are going to show up in market conditions, or they won't, but in any case, we have to do what we think is right. And, in the long run, it's important that financial conditions become aligned or are aligned with what we're trying to accomplish. And in the long run, they will be, of course, because we will do what it takes to get to our goals. And ultimately, that will mean that financial conditions will come along. But in the meantime, there can be back and forth, and I'm just focused on what's the right thing for us to do, and my colleagues are focused on that too.
The markets seem to think inflation is coming down credibly. Do you believe we're at the point where inflation is coming down credibly?
Listen, I welcome the progress. I think it's really good to see the progress that we're making. I think if you look at the 12-month measure, look at the 6-month measures, you see very low numbers. If you look at 12-month measures, you're still well above 2%. You're actually above 3% on core through November at PCE. That isn't to say I'm not calling into question the progress. It's great. We just need to see more. We need to see continued further progress toward getting back to 2%. That's what we need to see. So it's our job to restore price stability, and that it's one of our two jobs along with maximum employment, and they're equal. So we're very focused on doing that. As I mentioned, we're moving carefully at this point. We're pleased with the progress, but we see the need for further progress. And I think it's fair to say there is a lot of uncertainty about going forward. We've seen the economy move in surprising directions, so we're just going to need to see more further progress.
Gina.
Gina Smilik, New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. In the SEP from today, growth is notably below potential in 2024. If growth were to surprise us again in the way that it has for years now by being stronger than expected next year, would it still be possible to cut rates? Or put another way, is below trend growth necessary to cut rates, or would continued progress on inflation alone be sufficient?
So we'll look at the totality of the data. Growth is one thing. So is inflation, so is labor market data. So we'd look at the total, if we make decisions about policy changes going forward, we're going to look at all those things, and particularly about as they affect the outlook. It's ultimately all about the outlook and the balance of risks as well. So that's what we'd be looking for. If we have stronger growth, that'll be good for people. That'll be good for the labor market. It might actually mean that it takes a little longer to get inflation down to 2%. We will get it down to 2%. But if we see stronger growth, we will set policy according to what we actually see, and so that's how I would answer.
I guess the question I'm asking, if you don't mind a quick follow-up, I guess the question I'm asking is above trend growth itself a problem?
It's only a problem it's not itself a problem. It's only a problem insofar as it makes it more difficult for us to achieve our goals. And if you have growth that's robust, what that will mean is probably will keep the labor market very strong. It probably will place some upward pressure on inflation. That could mean that it takes longer to get to 2% inflation. That could mean we need to keep rates higher for longer. It could even mean ultimately that we would need to hike again. It just is. It's the way our policy works.
Go to Neil.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. How do you interpret the state of the labor market right now? And in particular, you've referred even today to evidence that it's coming into better balance. What would you need to see to conclude that it has reached that balance?
So on the better balance side, just a lot of things. It's you see job growth still strong, but moving back down to more sustainable levels given population growth and labor force participation. the things that are not quite, but let me go on with that list. You know, claims are low. If you look at surveys of businesses, they're sort of the era of this frantic labor shortage are behind us, and they're seeing a shortage of labor as being significantly alleviated. If you look at shortages of workers, whereas they thought job availability was the highest it had ever been or close to it, that's now down to more normal levels by so many measures: participation, unemployment, so many measures, the unemployment, job openings, quits, all of those things. So wages are still running a bit above what would be consistent with 2% inflation over a long period of time. They've been gradually cooling off, but if wages are running around 4%, that's still a bit above, I would say. And I guess there are just a couple of other, the unemployment rate is very, very low. And these are, but I would just say overall, the development of the labor market has been very positive. It's been a good time for workers to find jobs and get solid wage increases.
Claire?
Jones, Financial Times.
It may be. A common theme is that while inflation is coming down, and that's very good news, the price level is not coming down. Prices of some goods and services are coming down, but overall, in the aggregate, the price level is not good. So people are still living with high prices, and that is something that people don't like. And you know what will happen with that is wages are now real wages are now positive, so that wages are now moving up more than inflation as inflation comes down, and so that might help improve the mood of people. But we do see those public opinion surveys. The thing that we can do is to do our jobs, which is to use our tools to foster price stability, which has such great benefits over such long periods of time, and which is the thing that really enables us to work for and achieve an extended period of high employment, which is so beneficial for, you know, families and companies around the country.
Victoria?
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask, you know, on the flip side of if things start to deteriorate rapidly, if we do fall into a recession, if we do start to see unemployment rise at sort of the levels of inflation that we're seeing now, how would you all think about that in terms of rate cuts? Would that be a sign that you've done your job demand-wise?
Sorry, if
the economy looks like it's starting to fall into recession, if the jobless rate starts to rise?
That's not something we're hoping to see. Obviously, we're hoping to see something very different, which is continuation of what we have seen, which is the labor market coming into better balance without a significant increase in unemployment, inflation coming down without a significant increase in unemployment, and growth moderating without a significant increase in unemployment. That's what we're trying very much to achieve, and not something we're looking to see.
But would you take that as a signal that you should cut rates?
Obviously, what we'll do is we'll look at the totality of the data, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and certainly the labor data would be important in that. And you know, if you can describe a situation like that where if there were the beginning of a recession or something like that, then yes, that would certainly weigh heavily in that decision.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Television and Radio. Mr. Chairman, you were, by your own admission, behind the curve and started to raise rates to fight inflation. And you said earlier, again, the full effects of our tightening cycle have not yet been felt. How will you decide when to cut rates, and how will you ensure you're not behind the curve there?
So we're aware of the risk that we would hang on too long. You know, we know that that's a risk, and we're very focused on not making that mistake. And we do regard the two, you know, we've come back into a better balance between the risk of overdoing it and the risk of underdoing it. Not only that, we were able to focus hard on the price stability mandate And we're getting back to the point where, which is what you do when you're very far from one of them, one of the two mandates. You're getting now back to the point where both mandates are important, and they're more in balance too. So I think we'll be very much keeping that in mind as we make policy going forward. And the things we'll be looking at, I've already described. You know, we're obviously looking hard at what's happening with demand, and what we see the same thing other people see, which is a strong economy, which really put up quite a performance in 2023. We see good evidence and good reason to believe that growth will come in lower next year. And you see what the forecasts are. I think the median growth, median participant wrote down 1.4% growth, but you know, we'll have to see. It's very hard to predict. We'll also be looking to see progress on inflation and you know, the labor market remaining strong, but ideally without seeing the kind of large increase in unemployment that happens sometimes.
When you begin the cutting cycle, will it be essentially run the same way you do it now with raising rates, where you basically do trial and error cut and see what happens, or will you tie it to some particular measure of progress?
We haven't typically tried to articulate, with one exception, really specific target levels, which was, some of you will remember the thresholds that we used in, I guess, 2013. The answer is, these are things that we haven't, you know, really worked out yet. We're sort of just at the beginning of that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So if the Fed cuts rates, as the dot plot is showing, about 75 basis points, does that signal that there's a belief of weakness next year in the economy?
It wouldn't, if that were, first of all, let me just say, that isn't a plan. That's just accumulating what people wrote down. So that's not something, you know this, but allow me to say it again. We don't debate or discuss what the right, you know, whose SEP is right. We just say what they are and we tabulate them and publish them. So it's, you know, it's important for people to know that, but it wouldn't need to be a sign of, it could just be a sign that the economy is normalizing and it doesn't need the tight policy. It depends on, the economy can evolve in many different ways, right? So, but it could be more what I just described.
And you focused on core inflation. We've heard from in other meetings. How sticky is core inflation right now?
Well, that's what we're finding out, and we've seen real progress in core inflation. It has been sticky, and famously, the service sector is thought to be stickier. But we've actually seen reasonable progress in non-housing services, which was the area where you would expect to see less progress. We are seeing some progress there, though. And in fact, all three of the categories of core are now contributing. Goods, housing services, non-housing services, they're all contributing at different levels, you know, meeting by meeting, or rather report by report. So, yeah.
Okay, let's go to Katerina. Katerina Saraiva, Bloomberg News. Thanks for taking our questions. I just wanted to ask a little bit about, you know, we had some pretty positive data this morning and yesterday. I'm assuming those were not incorporated into the forecasts we see today, but I just wanted to ask, you know, how that kind of adds to your thinking, you know, on the inflation outlook.
Right. So we got CPI the morning of the first day, and we got PPI the next day, which informs the translation into PCE. So it's very, very late in the game, you know. But nonetheless, participants are allowed to, encouraged to update their SEP forecasts until probably mid-morning today. After that, so staff has to accumulate all of that and create the documents that you see. So until about mid-morning, a little maybe late morning, it's okay to update. And I believe some people did update their forecasts based on what we saw today.
Okay, and do you see, I mean, how are you, when you think about, you know, starting to think about the rate cuts next year or whenever they come, how do you think about the economy we're in now, kind of post-pandemic? Do you think that there's been significant structural shifts, and is that going to change how you look at a rate cut path?
The question of whether there have been fundamental structural shifts is really hard to know the answer, and a very interesting one right now. The one that would affect one that comes to mind, though, is just the question of where the neutral rate of interest is. And so, for example, if it's risen, and I'm not saying that it has, but if it were to have risen, that would mean that interest rates would need to be a little bit higher to convey the same level of restriction. The thing is, we're not really going to know that. You know, people will be writing papers about that 10 years from now and still fighting about it. So it's just that it's going to be uncertain. So we're going to be making policy in this, you know, difficult, uncertain, really unprecedented environment. Someone once said that you know the natural rate of interest by its works, and that's really right. But that's very difficult because policy operates with a lag. So it's one of the reasons why we slowed down this year. We started slowing down at this meeting last year, reducing the pace at which we were adding restriction. And over the course of this year, we really slowed down a lot to give those lags time to work. In terms of demand, has demand shifted more away from services into goods? You can make a case for that the shift back into services has not been complete, and it doesn't look like it's ongoing, but I don't know if that's right. Maybe people just bought so much stuff that they temporarily don't want any more stuff. They haven't got any place to put it.
Let's go to Jennifer.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. You said back in July that you needed to start cutting rates before getting to 2% inflation. As you mentioned, PCE inflation is now running at 3.5% on core. On a 6-month annual basis, core PCE is running at 2.5%. Though when you look at super core and shelter, they are, of course, stickier. So in looking at the different components of the data, how much closer do you have to get to 2% before you consider cutting rates?
I mean, the reason you wouldn't wait to get to 2% to cut rates is that policy would be too late. I mean, you'd want to be reducing restriction on the economy well before 2%, because before you get to 2%, so you don't overshoot. If we think of restrictive policy as weighing on economic activity, you know, it takes a while for policy to get into the economy, affect economic activity, and affect inflation. So I can't give you a precise answer, but if you look at what's in the SEP, and you know, I think you'll see a reasonable estimate of the time lags and things like that it would take.
Do you think below 3% would be reasonable?
I wouldn't want to identify any one precise point, because I would be able to look back then and probably find out that it turned out not to be right. But we'll be looking at it and looking at the broad collection of factors.
Hi, Chair Powell, Jean Young with Market News. Wanted to go back to the stickiness of inflation question. Over the past couple of years, a lot of central bankers have talked about the more difficult last mile of getting inflation back down to 2%. Yet it's also been surprising how fast inflation has come down this year. I'm curious, do you think something has changed in our understanding of inflation? Or do you subscribe to this notion still, or is it something different about the U.S. economy? Thank you.
I think this, you know, we felt since the beginning that it would be a combination of two factors. The first factor is just the unwinding of what happened in the pandemic, the distortions to supply and demand. And the second thing would be our policy, which was weighing on aggregate demand and actually making it easier for the supply side to recover because of lower demand. We thought those two things were going to be necessary. Sorry, say the last part of your question again.
If there was something different about the U.S. economy.
Yeah, so it's not that, it may or may not be about the U.S. economy being different. I think that this inflation was not the classic demand overload, pot boiling over kind of inflation that we think about. It was a combination of very strong demand, without question, and unusual supply side restrictions, both on the goods side but also on the labor side, because we had a participation shock. So this is just very unusual. And, you know, we had the view, my colleagues and I broadly had the view that we could get a lot of, you know, you had essentially a vertical supply curve, because you ran into the limits of capacity at very low levels because there weren't workers and because people couldn't, the supply chains were all broken. So we had the view that you could come straight down that vertical supply curve to the extent demand reduced, and something like that has happened. It happened so far. The question is, once that part of it runs out, and we think it has a ways to run. We definitely think that the sort of supply chain and shortages side has some ways to run. Does labor force participation have much more to run? It might. Immigration could help, but it may be that at some point you will run out of supply side help, and then it gets down to demand, and it gets harder. That's very possible. But to say with certainty that the last mile is going to be different, I'd be reluctant to suggest that we have any certainty around that. We just don't know. I mean, inflation keeps coming down, the labor market keeps getting back into balance, and it's so far so good. Although we kind of assume that it will get harder from here, but so far it hasn't.
Okay, we'll go to Megan for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thanks for taking our questions. Megan Casella with Barron's. I want to ask about the balance sheet, given the Fed's focus now on proceeding carefully and considering rate cuts. And can you talk us through what the latest thinking is, and has there been any consideration of altering the pace of quantitative tightening at all?
We're not talking about altering the pace of QT right now, just to get that out of the way. So balance sheet seems to be working pretty much as expected. What we've been seeing is, that we're allowing runoff each month. That's adding up. I think we're close to 1.2 trillion now. That's showing up. The reverse repo facility has been coming down quickly, and reserves have been either moving up or, as a result, or holding steady. At a certain point, there won't be any more to come out of, or there'll be a level where the reverse repo facility levels out, and at that point, reserves will start to come down. We still have, that we intend to reduce our securities holders until we judge that the quantity of reserve balances has reached a level somewhat above that consistent with ample reserves. And we also intend to slow and then stop the decline in size of the balance sheet when reserve balances are somewhat above the level judged to be consistent with ample reserves. We're not at those levels. With reserves close to $3.5 trillion. We don't think we're at those reserves. There isn't a lot of evidence of that. We're watching it carefully, and so far it's working pretty much as expected, we think.
Adjusting that thinking at all by the time you're considering or moving forward with rate cuts? Is that time to rethink, or are you still going to follow that thinking?
So I think they're on independent tracks. So you're asking, though, the question, I guess you're implying the question of can you continue with QT at such time, QT, which is a tightening action, at such time as policy is still tight? And the answer is it depends on the reason. If you're cutting rates because you're going back to normal, that's one thing. If you're cutting them because the economy is really weak, so you can imagine you have to know what the reason is to know whether it would be appropriate to do those two things at the same time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Končí. Zavrel knižku, Ujo pán skončil. No, a Dampola party začína. Čiže dozvedeli sme sa celkovo dosť veľa vecí, hlavne teda z projekcií. Nič teda, alebo teda bolo tam prekvapujúce to, že už aspoň uvažujú nad znížením úrokových sadzieb. Čiže to bola celkovo dosť prekvapivá vec. Zatiaľ, ako si môžete všimnúť, to s marketom celkovo spravilo dosť veľké divy. Troška, hej, sme ostali takí, akí sme. Dobre, spravím nejakú analýzku, čo sa Bitcoinu týka. Tá porada, hovorím, dopadla celkovo pozitívne, čiže teoreticky od dneška Bitcoin môže si ísť svojím vlastným smerom. Čaká nás ešte niečo zaujímavé a dosť dôležité. Pozrieme sa na ekonomický kalendár, či tam máme ešte niečo okrem Paulíka. Čiže Čo sa týka ďalších dát, tak tam budeme mať Európsku centrálnu banku zajtra a úrokové sadzby. Teoreticky by to mohlo mať nejaký zásah na market, ale skôr pochybujem. Snažia sa robiť presne to isté, čo Fed, až na to, že zatiaľ takú silu určite nemajú a následne piatok je totál pokoj. Čiže máme prakticky voľné ruky, alebo teda Bitcoin má voľné ruky, môže si teoreticky robiť teraz zo pár týždňov, alebo teda do nového roka, čo chce. Tým, že to nebola žiadna dumpola party, skôr teda pozitívny market, môže sa stať, že budeme sa pohybovať práve v týchto daných teritoriách. Na weekly, hej, od 45-47 po hodnotu 37-35, čiže toto je zatiaľ teda naša nová range na weekly, ktorú treba zatiaľ teda plne podporovať. Weekly zatiaľ teda v miernom vyklesaní na indikátoroch, ale nič katastrofálne tam teda príliš veľmi nie. Range máme jednoznačnú, daily vyzerá brutálne, ako som to rozprával už aj predtým. Prečo brutálne? Lebo tu máme fakt, že masakrálny odraz od 21 a 30 a naposledy 21 a 30 nás priniesla k tomu, že sme prekonali tú hodnotu rezistencie. Čiže toto minimálne podľa price akcie mi naznačuje, že máme teoreticky šancu sa dostať práve nad hodnotu alebo naspäť na hodnoty 45 až 47 tisíc dolárov. Je to ale jedna podmienka, a to práve konkrétne dnes, čiže tí, čo ste šťastlivci a nepôjdete spať, tak toto je tá úroveň. 41 981 dolárov. Na daily sa musíme udržať práve na touto hodnotou. Zatiaľ teda, čo sa price akcie týka, veľká, ale že veľká pecka, 21 plná hodnota podporí 1, 2, 3 deň. ADX vyzerá celkovo zaujímavo. Máme tu zase bíci sa toho chytili, čo je celkovo dobrá správa. Signálna línia je ale nasmerovaná smerom dole, čiže tam nič extra. No a tu vidíme presne tú úroveň, tú spodnú líniu supportu, ktorú tu máme, alebo teda bývalú rezistenciu, čiže aj daily, aj 12-hodinovka, čiže do tých 3 hodín 42 minút musíme zatvoriť na touto líniou a takisto aj zajtrajšok alebo ďalšia 12-hodinová sviečka nemôže prepadávať, alebo teda zajtra celý deň, čiže 2 12-hodinové sviečky nemôžu prepadávať cez hodnotu 42 tisíc dolárov, ale myslím si, že tam by nemal byť celkovo problém, ako náhle sa udržíme nad týmito danými úrovňami a zajtra sa zobudí market, tak to môže byť celkovo veľmi pekné šialenstvo a posun smerom hore. Čiže tu na 12-hodinovke to vyzerá takisto veľmi pekne bullish, potrebujeme sa ale udržať nad tou líniou 41 955 dolárov a to je asi jediná vec, čo potrebujete dneska vedieť. Skrz toho, že je tam dokonca podpora aj hodnoty 21. Čiže tým extrémnejší level. Ak sa udržíme nad touto úrovňou, tým pádom môžeme zase si nasadiť svoje bičie rohy a stúpať vyššie. Stochastic RSI a RSI sú nasmerované smerom hore, čiže tu je to celkovo pozitívne, ale zatiaľ teda na RSI nie je tam jasný cross, čiže takisto si musíme počkať na zatvorenie tejto sviečky a na zajtrajšiu sviečku a Stochastic RSI ten je bullish, takisto aj ADX, ale signálna línia, čiže tieto dáta sú proste jednoznačne ovplyvnené Fedom a uvidíme, že aký štandard si teda udržíme. Čiže práve preto treba počkať do zatvárania sviečok. Na každom jednom timeframe, originál na každom jednom timeframe vidno tu 41 900 a 42 000. Fakt, že extrémne dôležitá. Čiže môžeme sa pozerať práve teraz na long pozície, keď príde testovanie 42, a keď príde odrazenie, tak potom, hej, malo by to byť celkovo veľmi pekné ráno, ale ako náhle začneme zatvárať pod hodnotou 42 000 dolárov, tam už proste by som, hej, tesná stopka, tu na nič iné nevidím. Dobre, keby náhodou začal prepad, žiadnu katastrofu netreba očakávať, pokiaľ nie je narušená tá hodnota 200. Ako náhle padneme a keby sme po dnešných správach padli cez hodnotu 42 a 41, tak myslím si, že práve tá hodnota 37 000 nás nemusí vôbec nejako zastaviť. Čiže máme pred sebou veľmi zaujímavé TA na ďalšie týždne. Som veľmi rád, že ste tu teda boli na tomto danom live streame. Ja si idem dať voraz 1,5 hodiny. Zatiaľ teda ukončíme aj pool, čiže pool jednoznačne naznačuje, alebo teda ukazuje naladenie, aké si myslíte, že bude. Čiže Powell tento market potiahol do úplného neviem kde. Ostaneme v range 35 000 až 45 000 dolárov. 71% ľudí si to myslelo all time high týmto meetingom. Teoreticky, keď tomu dáme od meetingu po meeting, tak tieto predikcie nemusia byť ešte off, hej, hlavne teda musíme to dať z meetingu na meeting, čiže ďalší meeting 31. januára a uvidíme, že kam to teda Pavel až dokázal potiahnuť a že či ho market celkovo počúval. Ja vám veľmi pekne ďakujem za hodinku a pol vášho času, dúfam, že ste si to užili a minimálne aspoň sme mali trošička iný livestream, kedy sme počúvali toho šaša, čo zase akože príliš veľa vecí sa nám neudialo. Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne, vidíme sa v ďalšom